Bonne soirée à toutes et à tous. Welcome everyone. Je m'appelle Emily Keenley-Side de DHC, Fondation pour l'art contemporain. Il me fait grand plaisir de vous accueillir ici ce soir. Nous sommes ravis de recevoir Isabelle Loring Wallace dans le cadre de l'exposition Wim Delvoye en cours actuellement à DHC Fondation pour l'art contemporain jusqu'au 19 mars. Je tiens à remercier tout particulièrement Daniel Roberge du Musée des Beaux-Arts pour sa collaboration dans la réalisation de cette soirée, ainsi que les équipes techniques et administratives pour leurs efforts. La conférence ce soir aura lieu en anglais avec une période de questions à la fin. Nous vous invitons à poser vos questions dans la langue de votre choix. Nous pourrons les traduire avec plaisir. So again, welcome. This year, DHC Art is very proud to be celebrating 10 years of exhibiting international contemporary art here in the city, and have been fortunate to partner with the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts over much of this time. Many thanks to Daniel Roberge and the Education and Community Programs Department for their ongoing collaboration. Thanks also to the MMFA's technical team, as well as Maritis Carino and Marc-Olivier Bécotte for documentation tonight. Thanks to Phoebe Greenberg, DHC Art's founder and director, as well as Cheryl Sim, our managing director and curator, for their ongoing support and enthusiasm for education. I'd also like to thank Magdalena Fay and Victoria Carrasco for administrative assistance. And finally, to my colleagues in education, Amanda Beatty, Marie-Hélène Lemaire, and Daniel Fizet. Initiated in 2011, Dissections is a series of lectures and roundtable events presented as part of DHC Art's public programming and designed to encourage interdisciplinary discussions on contemporary art. For this edition, DHC Art Education is thrilled to welcome Isabelle Loring Wallace from the University of Georgia to talk about the work of Wim Delvoye. Her lecture will last approximately 1 hour and will be followed by a question and answer period at the end. So as a team, we came across Isabelle Loring Wallace's work in the research phase leading up to the opening of the exhibition Wim Delvoye. Amid much literature written on the art of Wim Delvoye in both English and in French, what struck us most about her work was the richness of her theorizing of Delvoye's work, and most notably the depth of her historical analysis and recontextualization. And thus we are so pleased she accepted our invitation to Montreal to shed further light on both DHC Art's exhibition, as well as the 2 Delvoye works currently here on display in the MMFA's Decorative Arts and Design collection. So if you haven't seen those, I encourage you to do so at another time. Isabelle Loring Wallace is Associate Professor of Contemporary Art at the Lamar Dodd School of Art at the University of Georgia, as well as Associate Director of Research and Graduate Studies. She's the author of numerous essays on a wide range of topics, ranging from mid-20th century American painting to early 21st century photography, video, and installation. She is the author of Jasper Johns, published in 2014, as well as the co-editor of 2 anthologies that reflect her commitment to thinking about contemporary art within broad cultural and historical contexts. Contemporary Art and Classical Myth, co-edited with Jennifer Hirsch in 2011, and Contemporary Art About Architecture, A Strange Utility, co-edited with Nora Wendell in 2013. Professor Loring Wallace is currently completing a 2nd book on Jasper Johns and developing a new project that considers recurring intersections between new media art and assorted Judeo-Christian themes. Welcome, Isabelle.
Can everyone hear me okay? If that changes, let me know. If I become too loud, let me know. Let me begin by extending a warm thank you to the DHC for the invitation, and particularly to the education team, which has been so delightful and so generous with me in answering my questions, which have probably been too numerous, and made everything about the experience of getting here and getting around town today very, very easy. It's also been wonderful to see the exhibition, so kudos to those behind the exhibition and all the many, many details that go into putting on such a show. I begin by calling your attention to a curatorial trend. In 3 of Wim Delvoye's recent exhibitions, including the 2012 show at the Louvre, the 2015 exhibition at the Heydayar Aliyev Center in Azerbaijan, and the current exhibition in Montreal. This sculpture, or some variation upon it, has been positioned at or before the exhibition's entrance, and has thus served as the de facto introduction to the artist's work. This evening, it also serves as a point of departure for my own remarks. For as I will argue, this work, whose title I will temporarily withhold, is also something of a passe-partout, a key by which we might unlock Delvoye's unorthodox and wildly heterogeneous oeuvre. Let's begin with the sculpture's dramatic installation at the Louvre. Visible from the museum's courtyard, and once again on entry to the museum, Delvoye's sculpture stood alone in the summer months of 2012, prominently displayed beneath IMP's iconic glass pyramid. Only the second sculpture to have been selected for this honor, Delvoye's work was unavoidable. It marked the museum's entrance for those approaching the pyramid complex above ground, while also dominating the space given over to shops and ticketing booths for those already en route to the Mona Lisa. Narrowly conceived, its purpose was to call attention to Delvoye's exhibition and to offer museum goers a preview of his work, some portion of which was on display in the lavish apartments of Napoleon III, including several additional works which take Gothic architecture as their notional subject and medium. At the same time, and somewhat more audaciously, it also served, or so I will argue, to commence and comment upon the grand narrative that unfolds within that museum. For as we shall see, Delvoye's work is keenly attuned to the history of art, and nowhere more so than in this curious object, in which Gothic and classical, modern and Baroque are all intelligently and strategically entangled. Saying what's at stake in these entanglements, and in art history's vigorous defense against them, is part of what this lecture aims to do. But first, the object as such. Faced with Delvoye's sculpture, one notices first its shape and scale, also its stainless steel surface, exaggerated in this image by the light that poured down on all sides through Pei's diamond-shaped windows. Conical and tapered at both ends, the version displayed at the Louvre, in concert with the grandeur of the space, is substantial at 11 meters tall and has the contours of a missile or unhusked ear of corn. The work is best described as a pair of twisted Gothic spires, sutured together at their broad ends, as if a torpedo atop its launching pad, poised eternally before takeoff. To be sure, a threat is implicit here, and if Delvoye's sculpture served to anticipate other Gothic works in the Louvre show and in the current exhibition, be they lacy metal dump trucks with beds in the shape of a nave, or a Gothic tower curved in on itself in the shape of a nautilus, this comparatively more abstract sculpture, made of stainless steel and perforated by glassless arched windows, also served as a worrisome foil for Pei's glass and steel pyramid, which was initially perceived as a threatening intervention in its own right. Commissioned to accommodate the Louvre's daily onslaught of visitors, the pyramid complex, which opened to the public in 1989, appeared futuristic to traditionalists and at the same time pharaonic, an interloper from a distant pre-classical past, and simultaneously, a suite of alien objects recently landed from an encroaching post-classical future. Of course, in time, Pei's pyramids found acceptance and even admiration from the general public, and for some, the logic of their installation was always apparent. For although Pei's pyramids are both pre- and post-classical, and seem to some to be wildly out of place within this 16th century complex of stone, their symmetry, stability, and geometric sense of order, in short, their classical underpinnings, pointed to affinities between styles and periods that are typically opposed. And as we shall see, it is precisely these oppositions, these antinomies between the classical and all it seeks to exclude, that Delvoye's Gothic sculpture systematically targets and unravels. As such, some discussion of the Gothic is in order. As some of you will know, the term Gothic is an unruly one, with diverse connotations across a bewildering variety of contexts and genres, some of which we will revisit. The key historical point is that the Gothic first emerged as a stylistic concept in conjunction with architecture, and was used as a pejorative in an effort to mark something off and differentiate it from the classical art of the Renaissance, itself, of course, a revival of classical antiquity. Entangled with the idea of various Gothic tribes who were perceived by Southern Europeans as barbaric, the term Gothic by the 17th century had come to connote crudity and excess in a stylistic sense, especially when seen in contrast to the classical art and its sober renewals. The groundwork for using the term this way was laid by Giorgio Vasari, whom many take to be the first art historian, thanks to the 1550 publication of his famous tome, The Lives of the Artist. Therein, he lamented the gradual decline of the arts following their early perfection in ancient Greece and Rome, typified by buildings such as the Parthenon, famous for its symmetry and judicious use of classical ornament. Vasari does not imply that the uncivilized Goths are solely to blame for a subsequent decline in the arts, but he does mention them often as contributing factors before suggesting that they ultimately deliver a decisive blow to art history's progressive trajectory. In fact, it is in the course of describing the many chapters of this protracted descent into what we unkindly call the Dark Ages that Vasari makes mention of Delvoye's heroes, the new architects, and here I'm quoting Vasari, who after the manner of their barbaric nations erected buildings in that style which we now call Gothic. Fortunately, Vasari's concerns would be assuaged in the course of his own lifetime, as Renaissance buildings like Bramante's Tempietto in Rome would soon return Western civilization to the purer style of the antique, another quote from Vasari, and put the aesthetic of the late medieval period in its place as a debased and graceless form of expression. Influential still, and key to the grand narrative of art history, the antagonism between the Gothic and the classical is also important to Delvoye's exhibition at the Louvre. It is, one could say, the work's subtext. Looking at an image like this one, it's clear that Delvoye's sculpture literalizes the notion not just of difference, its elongated ornamental form standing in stark contrast to both the pyramid and the overtly classical structure of the Louvre, but also, with its jagged edges and needle-like nose, the notion of hostility and incipient violence, as if the Gothic might again derail Western civilization, shattering its very structure into a pile of irrecuperable shards. Yes, there's a curious way in which Delvoye's sculpture rearranges the terms of the debate that most recently marked this site. For if cultural critics used to discuss the differences between the pyramid and the Louvre, whether in admiration or disgust, Delvoye's sculpture now has us see through it, forcing a point of view in which the pyramid and palace, modern and classical, both align in apparent opposition to the Gothic. Then again, Delvoye's sculpture isn't merely Gothic. It too is a matter of pyramids, albeit ones that are distended, sutured together, and busy with detail. In fact, if one attends carefully to Delvoye's work, one sees that in many ways, Delvoye's sculpture is the uncanny reflection of Pei's pyramid, or perhaps the pyramid as seen in a mirror at a funhouse. For like the pyramid, Delvoye's work is both sculpture and architecture, and a steel armature perforated by windows. What's more, the form of Delvoye's symmetrical self-mirroring object echoes the forms and overall structure of Pei's complex, not only because the complex includes inverted pyramids that descend into the space of the Louvre, but also because the reflecting pools on the main pyramid's three sides create a comparable illusion, at times making the main pyramid into a symmetrical diamond in its own right. Thus, having compromised the distinction between the classical and its most remote enemies, the pre-classical past and the postmodern present, Delvoye's sculpture also calls into question a more vehemently preserved antipathy between the classical and the Gothic, showing us, both literally and metaphorically, that the one is ever housed within the other. Yet, Gothic art and architecture aren't the only phenomena charged with possessing an anti-classical aesthetic. In time, the Gothic comes to share this dubious honor with the Baroque, which was also, and through its very name, demonized as an unwelcome departure from the ostensibly normative tendencies of the classical tradition. And it's in this regard that the installation at the DHC really sings and reveals additional implications of Delvoye's art historical mischief. Again positioned as the exhibition's first object of regard, Delvoye's sculpture has reappeared in Montreal in slightly different form. Please note the root-like structure of the sculpture's bottom half, and is surrounded by sculptures that shift the terms of its reception and extend still further the object's engagement with the history of art. At a glance, it's clear that the objects in this room, the ones chosen to converse with the gallery's lone Gothic interloper, have certain things in common. Not only their scale and opulent material, a sumptuous, highly reflective nickeled bronze, but also a sense of agitation as they twist, writhe, and seemingly replicate. They are, in a word, Baroque, despite being very much a product of the 21st century, and as such, they necessitate further reflection on periodization and the prejudices that so often attend it. The history and etymology of the term Baroque is complex, but scholars agree that the word derives from one or more variants of the Italian word barocco, all of which denote irregularity and excess, originally in the context of jewelry, as in the Baroque or irregular pearl. Hence, when used subsequently in conjunction with the visual arts, as it was by the Swiss art historian Heinrich Wölfflin in his canonical text, Renaissance and Baroque, the point, as illustrated by a comparison of Michelangelo and Bernini's Davids, was to insist on the Baroque's difference from the sober classicism of antiquity and its revivals. Characterized by a sense of drama and energetic movement, the Baroque style, exemplified by the Bernini sculpture at right, which begins for Wölfflin with various late Renaissance or Mannerist tendencies, is associated with dynamism, fluidity, and exuberance. Accordingly, it replaced the circle with the oval, the vertical with the diagonal, and as is most evident here, the cylinder with its more dramatic cousin, the spiral, a word which brings us quickly back to Delvoye's recent sculptures. Based on 3D scans of academic bronzes, many of Delvoye's recent works make use of exaggerated spirals, often at the expense of the sculpture's legibility, as if the style and not any particular subject are his ultimate point. And while it is not always easy to tell what one is looking at, in this case, a detail of Delvoye's revisioning of Clodion's Kiss of the Satyr, seen previously at right, it seems important to note that these subjects are typically classical in nature, since such subjects, when seen in conjunction with Delvoye's decidedly unclassical treatment, again suggest Delvoye's interest in commingling concepts thought to oppose one another in principle, literalizing the notion that the Baroque distorts the classical, twisting it in ways that pervert its reserved aesthetics, Delvoye's sculptures also work hard to align these categories, exposing affinities where we are trained to see difference. After all, a drunken, libidinous satyr plainly highlights the legendary interest of the ancients in excess, the very crime of which the Gothic and Baroque are accused. Further undermining received notions of the classical are Delvoye's Rorschach-inspired sculptures, as seen here in yet another variation of Clodion's academic bronze. Mirrored along their vertical axis, works like this one read as if three-dimensional versions of inkblot images used by psychologists to assess an individual's emotional response. And in this way, Delvoye uses the classical penchant for symmetry against the very ideas for which it traditionally stands, namely rationality, objectivity, and order. As we saw, a similarly deconstructive approach underwrote Delvoye's installation at the Louvre, in which the Baroque was also implicated. For if Delvoye's work most obviously refers to Gothic architecture, its torqued form also leads viewers to Baroque sculpture. For example, Bologna's Rape of the Sabine Women of 1583, one hallmark of which is the illusion of movement as facilitated by serpentine lines that extend upward to form the dynamic shape of a spiral. Evident in Delvoye's sculpture, but conjoined with the doubled forms of Gothic architecture, the spiral is nevertheless arrested in Delvoye's missal, perfectly still, yet seeming to bore its way through space, incongruously, counterproductively, as if in two directions at once. In this way, the spiral's association with animate ascent, always ever up, is neutralized, just as in another sense, the aspirational element of Gothic architecture, its churches ever higher and thus ever closer to God, is canceled by the object's classicizing symmetry, which extends the work up and down in equal proportion. The same might be said of the version on display in the current exhibition, as this iteration of the work, for all its torque, is quite literally rooted, a fact that again opposes the dynamism of the work's upper half and lends a classicizing sense of stability to a work that is otherwise about movement. The implications of this contradictory strategy are manifold. First, and this applies to the iteration shown at the Louvre and here at the DHC, Delvoye's conjunction of spiral and steeple brings the Gothic and Baroque together and dramatizes the notion that they are aligned in their perceived opposition to the classical. As Western intellectuals have repeatedly affirmed, they constitute the other side of Western civilization's coin, the nadirs that have set off its classical and classicizing peaks. And yet, in another sense, it is the very prospect of these oppositions that Delvoye's sculpture targets. First, because the sculptures are neither Gothic nor Baroque, but as noted, a neutralized form of them both. And second, because the unruly hybridity of Delvoye's objects, at once classical, Gothic, and Baroque, calls attention to the instability of these categories and the untenability of arguments so often used to fortify them. But to what end these deconstructive propositions? And in what way might this historiographic argument align with tires, feces, religion, and DNA, all of which are also at issue in Delvoye's heterogeneous oeuvre? Answering this question requires saying a bit more about the idea of the Gothic, which is my next task, before returning in conclusion to Delvoye's double spire and its recent installation at a venue that is as futuristic as the Louvre is classical. I've already begun to suggest that there are few ideas as complex as Gothic, which holds purchase within the fields of history, art history, and literature. Much of the confusion derives from the fact that the term means different things and denotes different time periods in literary and art historical circles. Add to this the historical fact of the tribe known as the Goths, and one has a real terminological mess. Let's quickly pry these facets of the Gothic apart before exploring how they combine to form a received notion of the term, now deployed with authority by Delvoye. In the first instance, there are the Goths themselves, an ancient East Germanic tribe rumored to have come from modern-day Sweden. Migrating west and south, they made their way to modern-day Poland and East Germany over the course of the 3rd and 4th centuries, eventually splitting into the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, the latter of whom are famous for having achieved the sack of Rome in 410 AD. More than any other event, it is this invasion that cemented the Goths' reputation as the enemy of Western civilization, making barbarism synonymous with their name. In addition, these historical events provide a context for many of the themes explored in Gothic literature, which so often turns on the concepts of incivility, transgression, and invasion, all of which are also at issue in the art of Wim Delvoye. For as we have already begun to see, Delvoye uses the forms of Gothic architecture, but does so in the service of ideas that are more routinely related to the concerns of Gothic literature, which postdates Gothic art by a good half-century. The pertinent facts about the latter are as follows. As you all know, Gothic architecture and art, exemplified here by Chartres Cathedral and a detail of its west portal, are a late medieval phenomenon that originates in the middle of the 12th century in France and lasts until the middle of the 15th century, by which time a classical revival is well underway. Called modern by contemporaries, the new style of art and architecture eventually earned the description Gothic for 2 reasons. First, because it originally flourished in the north before spreading across the rest of Europe, and second, because various humanists found this label a useful way of distinguishing these more exuberant, grandiose forms from those of classical art, with which they wanted to align. In other words, just as the Visigoths invaded Rome, so Gothic art, at times erroneously linked to these early Gothic tribes, was seen as a threat to the legacy of classical antiquity. There is one more chapter in all of this, and here the art historical and literary come together in opposition to the rational humanist impulses of modernity and the Enlightenment. The first self-consciously Gothic novel, Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, subtitled A Gothic Novel, was written by an English man of letters who also played a major role in the late 18th century vogue for reviving Gothic architecture. His home, Strawberry Hill, located in Twickenham, southwest of London, dates from the 17th century. But shortly after its purchase in 1749, Walpole remodeled the estate, adding various Gothic elements to both interior and exterior. Likewise, his novel conjures the late medieval period and deploys Gothic architecture as a meaningful backdrop. Originally published anonymously, the novel has a complex conceit, which Walpole explains in his book's preface. Claiming that the tale was first published in Italian in 1529, he observes that the story was actually... Should I do something about that? Aha. We're good. The green light is on. Claiming that the tale was first published in Italian in 1529, he observes that the story was actually composed several centuries earlier within a properly Gothic or medieval context. The plot of the novel centers on Manfred, the gloomy Prince of Otranto, who has fallen tragically in love with his son's intended Isabella. This is as romantic as the talk will get tonight, so enjoy. Predictably, this romance is ill-fated, and in the course of the novel, characters are subject to the extreme emotional states, as well as a number of other inexplicable forces. Indeed, we are prepared for the role that the supernatural will play in this tale from the beginning, since the novel opens with the son's death at the hands of a statue of the previous Prince of Otranto. Mysteriously, its helmet comes loose and crushes Manfred's son. Many Gothic novels are set in the Middle Ages, wherein Gothic architecture is a recurring feature. But as literary scholars repeatedly attest, the Gothic genre is resilient and elastic, enduring endless adaptations in written and filmic form. Thus, although initially set against medieval backdrops, populated by degenerate counts and virtuous maidens, the Gothic soon came to encompass scientists, vampires, and aliens in urban, suburban, and extraterrestrial locations. Taken together, they evidence the impressive adaptability of the genre, and by virtue of what does not change, its essence, which I'll try to summarize quickly. Originally serving as an antidote to the optimism of the Enlightenment, Gothic literature and film is ever a matter of doubt and anxiety, as well as the oppositions from which they stem. Reason versus emotion, man versus both monster and machine, the clear light of reason versus the ambiguities and depravities of emotion, the superstitions of the East versus the West's purported secularity, the uncivilized past versus the progressive, acculturated present. Within a Gothic narrative, these dichotomies are rendered temporarily uncertain, as is the society they undergird and maintain. Equally important to Gothic fiction are the concepts of invasion and transgression, which typically inspire this uncertainty, as when Count Dracula, the immortal, feudal figure from the East, arrives in London with the aim of feeding on and infecting his modern mortal counterparts via a barbaric, bloodthirsty practice that confuses a number of additional distinctions: insemination and infection, life and death, heterosexuality and homosexuality, man and beast, self and other. Indeed, although the particulars vary, the Gothic tale is often the tale of the Goths, at least as the West has preferred to tell it. An ill-intentioned invasion of an ancient, even primordial thing that hails from somewhere else, often the North or the East, but sometimes outer space, and sometimes the protagonist's own unconscious or past, the effect of which is the contamination of one thing with its demonized opposite. How this relates to Delvoye may already be clear. Supo is the name of the sculpture to which this lecture has so often returned, a fact I withheld in favor of more formal and historical concerns. As the artist has remarked, Supo is short for suppository, and with that, we find ourselves in well-trod territory, at least for this particular artist. From small-scale prints made by the impress of a lipsticked anus on hotel stationery, to ceramic tiles installed on the floor, decorated with arabesque turds, Delvoye's fascination with feces, defecation, and anality is well established, and finds its most elaborate expression in his well-known Cloaca series, a body of 10 high-tech machines that eat and defecate on cue within the public space of the museum or gallery. There's a good deal to say about all these works, and especially the latter logo-bearing machines. Yet in this context, the simplest point might be the most apt. When considered in isolation and together as a larger body of work, these images and objects recall our strange fascination with defecation and the processes by which it appears. Feces and suppositories are clearly linked, but they are also fundamentally different. The question for us is this: how are they relevant to Supo and all that's been said about this sculpture already? Let's start with feces and then move to its medicinal counterpart, the suppository. That feces is transgressive goes without saying. That it inspires nervousness and anxiety is also beyond debate. That it comes from the past and makes an unwelcome incursion into the present is also apparent. Moreover, like the Goths and the protagonists of so many Gothic novels, feces crosses borders, temporarily confusing inside and outside, self and other, subject and object. Hence, the highly regulated business of defecating, which the Cloaca series took to an absurd extreme, and the speedy elimination of feces, immediately disavowed on appearance. Of course, hygiene is an important factor in waste management, and there are plenty of practical reasons for separating man from an object of his own making, even if it was once housed inside him within the confines of his own intestines. Even so, the agreed-upon benefits of such practices do not suffice to explain our attitude toward our body's own waste products, making this rich territory for numerous intellectuals, psychoanalysts, and artists, including, of course, Wim Delvoye, who has found the notion of border crossing of interest across a wide range of media and subject matter. Back to Delvoye's sculpture. By virtue of its shape and title, Supo is implicated in an anal discourse, but in ways that are notably different from feces. As is well known, a suppository is a delivery system for medicine, inserted into the rectum, unlike feces, which is routinely expelled from its confines. Hence, the border crossings of a suppository and the desired dissolution of its contents into the bloodstream are done in the name of good health and with the blessing of the individual whose borders are crossed. With this in mind, let's consider at long last the significance of Supo's title. Already described as hybrid, transgressive, and an agent of dissolution with respect to various stylistic categories, Supo, by virtue of its title, reframes the ideas of transgression, dissolution, transforming these concepts and thus its own effect into a positive force, at once desirable and beneficial. Accordingly, we must rethink the notion of threat in relation to Delvoye's sculpture, conceding that its title makes Pei's pyramid into an ass, as Delvoye observed, that is apparently in need of relief. As we've already seen, the styles of Western art history and the many ideas for which they stand are provocatively commingled in Supo, something that was especially highlighted during the course of its installation at the Louvre. What's driven home by the work's title is the fact that these perversions are conceived as a beneficent form of aid administered toward positive ends. Of course, there are important precedents for the idea of a healing and beneficent hybrid. Take the merciful figure of Christ, for example, who has appeared in Delvoye's work with increasing frequency since 2006. At once mortal and immortal, man and God, the inhuman hybrid figure of Christ is the archetypal border crosser, violating lines that are both real for believers and conceptual. Moving between the sacred and secular realms, assuming both human and divine form, Christ is, by his own account, both Alpha and Omega, a point Delvoye conceptualizes well in several of his Holy Family works, all of which can be described as a crucifix bent into the shape of a circle without end. Thus, while the hybridity of Dracula makes him monstrous, like Christ, the vampire also drops out of time and promises immortality. The inhuman hybridity of Christ The fact that he is simultaneously two irreconcilable things is nothing less than the miraculous sign of God's love, whose blood Christians ingest in the ritualistic form of the Eucharist. In this way, Christ aligns not only with the Gothic figure of Dracula, Christ's perverse reiteration, but also with Delvoye, who believes in the redemptive, healing power of impurity variously conceived. Indeed, in the end, one must concede that there is a religious dimension to Delvoye's work, a fact the artist seems prepared to admit. Among his recent Gothic works, many of which get their charge from combining the ornate aesthetic of Gothic cathedrals with the modern forms of assorted utility vehicles, here, yet another kind of unexpected, impure hybrid. There are also a few small-scale Gothic churches, as well as a series of 7 standalone stained glass windows, one for each day of the week. As seen here, their imagery derives from X-rays of the body, ours and those of small animals, with special attention paid to sex, feces, and the parts of the body they implicate. Certainly from a Christian point of view, such imagery is irreverent and deliberately at odds with an implied religious context. But if one considers such topics from a secular perspective, it is possible to see among them a shared interest in the idea of transgression and contamination. After all, sex is an activity in which the body is invaded and transgressed, often to ecstatic effect. Likewise, defecation is the activity that reminds us daily of the body's permeability, confusing in the process the distinction between inside and out. Included among Delvoye's recent works are several metal sculptures painted so as to look like tires that have been spliced, manipulated, and sutured back together again. Like Suppo's stagnant double spiral and the wheelless Maserati installed here, they are suggestive of movement and stasis simultaneously. For one could no sooner use this car and motorcycle tires than one could locate the inside or outside of the tire's interlocking loops. Moreover, like the assorted works in the Holy Family series, some of which you see here, the tire works can all be described as Mobius strips, notable for having only one side, even as they appear to have two. In theory, a Mobius strip can be complex or simple, as the variety of Delvoye's sculptures begins to demonstrate. But what is consistent among them is the impossibility of distinguishing between their two sides, as the famous anecdote about the ant makes clear. If an ant were to crawl along the length of a Mobius strip, it would eventually return to its starting point without ever having crossed an edge, and having traversed the entire length on both sides. Thus, while other works by the artist revel in the theatrical crossing of boundaries, or call attention to the liminal zones that serve as boundaries, as with Delvoye's tattooed pigskins and anal prints on hotel stationery, the Tire and Holy Family works use the concept of the Mobius strip to bear out the idea of the boundary as illusion, something we cling to despite the difficulty, and in these works, the impossibility of maintaining these kinds of distinctions. That objects in the Tire series also conjure the double helix, their spokes as if the rungs of a ladder, seems important, since the idea of the double helix is overtly referenced by the artist in two works that turn on the conventional image of the crucifixion. Made of patinated bronze, double helix crucifix of 2006 and 9 or at 985 and 470 centimeters respectively, imposing works, populated by several representations of Jesus along their twisting helical forms. Neither religious nor indifferent to religious ideas, the double helix sculptures allow us to clarify the role that religious references play in Delvoye's work, be they the ecclesiastical forms of Gothic architecture, crucifixions in the form of a Mobius strip, or stained glass windows that make reference to defecation and sex. Discovered in 1953 by James Watson and Francis Crick, the double helix structure of DNA has numerous implications well beyond the scope of this essay. As deployed by Delvoye in both versions of double helix crucifix, it is, at the very least, a secular counterpoint to the image of Christ and attendant Christian beliefs about the origin of human life. Yet it seems to me that the sculpture's juxtaposition of science and religion actually reveals a deeper commonality between these two spheres that in turn suggests the relevance of the double helix motif to Delvoye's concerns more generally. We've said already that Delvoye is interested in border crossings and that Christ is emblematic of this idea within Christianity. We've also noted that in Delvoye's series of standalone stained glass windows, the artist turns away from religion to embrace secular, even profane activities that also entail the crossing of borders. Taken together, the basic idea seems to be this. Delvoye is sketching out the basis for a secular religion, one dedicated to impurity, hybridity, and fluidity. As his stained glass windows seem to suggest, affirming one's faith in the healing power of these ideas requires participation in acts that recall the body's porousness, while shamelessly calling attention to facets of our anatomy that open out onto the space of another. Needless to say, Gothic architecture is an appropriate style for Delvoye's newfangled church, both because the effect of light on porous walls confuses distinctions between inside and outside, and because subsequent critics saw in its excesses the kind of invasive barbarism that Delvoye seems to enjoy. With this in mind, what seems most compelling about the double helix, aside from the fact that it carries weight as the locus of human identity, is the very fact of its structure, the irreducible doubleness it identifies as the essence of man. Indeed, if one takes the structure of DNA seriously, and after all, it is the structure that allows for the replication of genetic information, one comes to a startling realization. At his genetic essence, man is not one thing or another, but the effect of two things that ceaselessly come together and fall apart, but without ever dissolving into discrete, autonomous entities. Thus, in Delvoye's materialist religion, Christ is neither irrelevant nor exalted, since the ideas for which he stands, non-identity, hybridity, irreducibility, are likewise central to man, and not only in the exceptional context of sexuality and digestion. For as the lateral expanse of the double helix crucifix seems to suggest, the ideas of man and Christ are entangled, not merely in the Christian sense that Christ is God incarnate, but also through the fact of their shared irreducibility, neither this nor that, but always the dynamic play of two things at once. Just 3 years after its exhibition at the Louvre, Supo again introduced audiences to the art of Wim Delvoye, and once again, the experience of this work was enhanced by an extraordinary venue. The Heydar Aliyev Center in Baku opened to the public in 2012 and was designed by Zaha Hadid, a world-famous architect renowned for buildings that are both visionary and controversial. Glamorous and extravagant, the building is comprised of sweeping organic forms and is wholly devoid of seams or right angles. And because the building is itself a kind of flower or exotic landscape, it lacks ornamentation of any kind. Instead, the smooth white roof curves to form a wall, the wall gradually extends to become the ground, and the ground expands and becomes architecture in turn as the building seeps into the earth and extends covertly beneath the green expanse of the lawn beneath one's feet. Inside, the building gleams like a jewel, white upon white, with thin strips of embedded electric light that read like airplane trails or comets, as if the whole of the building is in motion above, around, and beneath its visitors, who cannot help but feel plodding and Euclidean by contrast. At the Louvre, and now at the DHC, Supo served as a deconstructive element, highlighting various oppositions for the purpose of pointing to their instability. It established ideas to undermine them and drew lines of demarcation only to retrace them with the pencil's other end. At the Haydar Aliyev Center is a different kind of building, and therein, Supo functioned differently, mirroring the elusiveness of its context and the sense of movement it everywhere implies. For when housed within a structure that obscures doorways with walls shaped like a nautilus or breaking wave, Supo ebbed too, only to return to one's contemplation altered in ways that are almost imperceptible. The spire became a minaret, the twisting spiral a form of vegetal abstraction, and simultaneously a vortex in which its styles and many contradictory ideas were emulsified, and by the power of the building's dynamic design, suspended in a state of temporary resolution. At the DHC, the experience now continues, past tires and dump trucks, tattooed pigskins, and torqued crucifixions. And we, like ants, proceed, covering it all, but without ever encountering an edge. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I'm an educator at DHC Art, and I was really interested in, you were talking about how Supo Carmagnaca is a key work in his work, and you were talking about, I'm very interested in the roots at the bottom of the sculpture, and visitors are very curious about it. So you were saying how those roots can be seen as this classical sense of stability, giving stability to this twisted column. I would love to hear you talk more about this symbol of the tree or the forest in relationship to Gothic cathedrals.
I'll try. I guess the place that I would go first is not to the cathedral, but rather to the myth of Daphne and Apollo. I don't know that I have all of the details of the myth at my command at this exact moment, but as I recall, it culminates somewhat dramatically with Daphne crying out to her father that she please spare him for her unhappy destiny of marrying Apollo. And he grants her do I have this right? He grants her her wish by turning her into a tree. And so the good news is that she gets out of the marriage, but the bad news is, of course, that she's stuck in place. She, the one who loved to run wild in the woods. So I think there are various ways in which, some of them quite straightforward and practical, and some of them literary and mythological, the idea of a tree's roots connote this sense of fixity, of being in one place. And for me, that was interesting because it articulated by some other means this contradiction between stasis and movement that I see very often in Delvoye's work. As for the relation of all of that to the Gothic cathedral, I'm not sure I know what to say. Is there something in particular that you were you down a certain path?
No, it's perfect. It answers the question. I was, yeah. Maybe sometimes the Gothic cathedral sometimes is seen as having its origins in the forest, or can be, in the image of the forest. So, but
well, it is the case that the spooky forest is a favored locale for various Gothic narratives.
That's it.
So eventually the forest, along with myriad other places, will be co-opted by Gothic literature as a appropriately dark and mysterious context in which things happen in the shadows and so on. And of course, the Gothic cathedral, as I mentioned there in passing, was notable architecturally not only for its height, but for the way in which it seemed to dematerialize, as you know, because of the size of the windows and the degree to which the light made those walls seem to disappear. So that's also a way in which the Gothic cathedral kind of reflects a notion of permeability and instability, and maybe also movement.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question about work you showed quickly, which is at the current exhibition at DHC. It's the car with the inscriptions. I read Arabic, but I was not sure if it was Arabic or Farsi. And the meaning of one of the words is al-Ma'raj, which is the ascension of the Prophet into heaven. So I don't know if it has like a connection with the religion or something else.
Well, I have to say that the asking of your question has made it clear to me that you know more about it than I do. And in fact, I was talking with Daniel about these inscriptions in the gallery earlier today, and if he doesn't mind terribly, I'm going to put him on the spot to intervene, because beyond saying that it's Farsi and not Arabic, I think I'm in dangerous territory.
I'm going to hog on the mic and jump in. This was also a question that we had as we were touring the show with some students and visitors, because there seems to be a narrative as you're looking at the sculpture. I don't know if everyone has seen the exhibition, but as you're walking around the sculpture, you really feel like there's almost like a story being inscribed in the ornamentation, and there is literally a story inscribed within the medallions, which all have this text. And Mirage is one of the I mean, you have the accent way better than I will ever have, but some visitors have suggested that it really is linked to the ascension of the Prophet Muhammad, and so specifically the vehicle used by Muhammad in the ascension finds a kind of a contemporary counterpoint in the luxury sports car. This idea that religious and luxury can kind of coexist within one object, which kind of makes sense with the...
And always have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think Gothic is a prime example of the luxurious and the religious kind of coexisting within one building or... Mm-hmm.
I might be way out of line here, but I'm going to try. Thank you very much. When I saw the exhibit, I had this feeling that I was seeing something that was very actual, in the sense that it spoke to me in a way of many things that are happening right now. There's this sense of nostalgia, this sense of looking backwards, this sense of making stuff great again. And there's a kitsch aspect to his work, or to what I saw, in the sense that he himself is trying to take something that was once great and literally turn it around and to make it something like even greater, I feel. And this connection with the religious, as we were speaking, and also his understanding of how brands work, and himself as he works as a brand, signing his paintings or drawings, as with the Disney's D. I wonder how he feels, and you kind of addressed it a little bit with the sense that a suppository is supposed to bring some sort of aid. What would be his answer? Is he really trying to bring forward a solution, or is it only based in a critique of how we see the world going forward? In the sense that I wonder if he has a sense of proudness that goes along what he's doing. And it kind of felt that way on the last slide of your presentation, seeing it like in a more apropos architectural environment. It felt as if he could be pleased about how it looked and how it became something. So I'm wondering, is he in a position towards something, or is he really trying to, or hoping for a solution to come out of his work? That was my question.
Oh, it's always a little bit dangerous when you try to imagine what an artist thinks. And as art historians, we try not to do that too much, but I'll give it a shot. My reading of the work, and therefore of him, is that it is both deconstructive and suggestive of, if not a solution, then maybe a way forward. What I mean by that is that in making works that are deconstructive, as I tried to suggest many of these works are, inevitably, of course, you tear certain things down. And in his case, as I tried to suggest, he's interested most basically in the works I was discussing in breaking down certain kinds of stylistic categories. And you might say, so what? Like, what are the implications of doing that? Who cares? I think, in a way, it's a metaphor for breaking down any kind of categories and thinking again about any kind of opposition. And of course, one can think politically there as you like. And then, having broken them down, a certain space emerges for the possibility of something else. And I think his primary contribution is in making a space in which the something else can happen. Now, whether or not he is the architect for that new something, or whether he leaves that to the spectator to erect something on, not to be overly dramatic, but the ruins of certain kinds of categories is maybe an open question. But I do think that in the ludic aspect of the work, in the playfulness of the work, there's a suggestion of optimism. And so while he doesn't, I think, prescribe the specific way in which we might go forward, there is, for me, a sense of, as I said, play and therefore optimism about the possibility that another path is possible and that it will be less maybe burdensome than the structures we've erected, the intellectual structures, the edifices intellectually that are our current legacy. Does that speak to your question?
No, yeah. And the thing about the religion is that he plays so much with everything that is religious. That I feel that I wonder where he stands upon, himself, to what he's creating. I saw an interview of him, and just the way he talks, or the way he acts, or the way he feels about what he's doing, he is very conscious that he's becoming himself a brand, and he's becoming a product. So I wonder how he feels about himself. Like a church-like aspect of his work. Does he feel that he's becoming some sort of a god from the art world? And how would he feel about someone calling him, or even going to a museum and being in awe of what I'm seeing? Would he be pissed about me having like that type of reaction? And that's where the pride, I feel, comes along in his all religious path toward towards something. I wonder where he stands about what he's putting together from the religious aspect of his work versus the critique that he's trying to put forward? Is he proud of his critique?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. But I also think that, I mean, to your point about whether or not it's problematic that he might now occupy the status of an art star or a minor deity in that constellation, I think that would probably be okay with him, and moreover advantageous. I think it's pretty clear from his work that he imagines that the way to interrogate something, whether it's architecture or the art world or capitalism or whatever it might be, is to inhabit it. It's not, he doesn't imagine that it's possible or even productive, I think, to stand outside of something and point a finger at it, but rather that in order to comment upon something and maybe even allow for a different possibility to emerge, one has to get inside that thing and kind of expose it from the inside. And so if you were to tell him that he's an art god, first of all, I'm sure he'd be flattered because he's human, and who doesn't want to be, complimented in such a way? But I think he would also see it as proof that his strategy is working in a way, because just the simple fact of you're asking the question makes it clear that you're now thinking about the art world in those terms, that you have a kind of self-consciousness now about the fact that the art world is structured in a certain kind of way, and within it there are people who receive more accolades than others, and you're thinking about why that might be. And so that suggests a level of ideation that maybe would have gone, that other artists might not achieve had they not so aggressively inhabited those ideas. Does that?
Yeah. You mentioned that he was building kind of a religion of materiality previously. But do you think, I feel like through a lot of his work, he's transgressing like religion, the art world, and and science in a way. Do you think he's rather building almost a religion of transgression in a way? Do you understand?
Yes. Yes, I do think that. I think transgression, contamination, those would be the kind of guiding principles of this theology, if we want to use those terms. My point about materiality was that one of the ways in which he suggests his investment in the idea of transgression is through his use of materials and through his suggestion that the body specifically is a material that is transgressed all the time, inevitably in the course of day-to-day life, and also, of course, in exceptional moments, like, say, getting in a car accident, for example. So it's not that the materiality is the most important thing. It's just, you're right, transgression is probably the more important concept. It's just that materiality is one of, and the kind of contamination of one material by another, one body by another, is one of the ways in which one might swear allegiance to a transgressive religion.
And do you think, I guess this is more speculative, but do you think there will come a point in which transgression will be impossible in maybe his work or just in the art field in general?
What do you think?
I love your answer. I can't see that.
I mean, I think, orthodoxy is always shifting, so the target will always be different, but there'll always be some idea to oppose and invade and have fun with, I think. I hope.
Do you think he'll be transgressing himself at a point? Do you think that's possible?
Well, I think he already is. I mean, I think in turning his signature into a logo, he's already moving in, and I guess I should say too that a lot of the X-ray imagery, like for example in the stained glass windows, in many cases that's his own body. So in ways that are both literal and straightforward, and in ways that are more conceptual, I think he's already interrogating and compromising his own status in relation to the work.
I think I'm going to try and formulate a question too. You named certain oppositions in your presentation, self and other. I can't recall all of the others, but you mentioned them more than once, and I was very struck by the last slides you presented and Supo's position in the Zaha Hadid building. Mm-hmm. It's quite contrasted with the Louvre spaces, and I was wondering if we could maybe add gender as a structural opposition, yeah, and try to see if we can think of gender as or femininity and masculinity as opposing forces in his work, and how we could link it to their roles in Gothic, either architecture or literature. I think a lot of people also, when we tour the show with them, tend to see his work as very overtly masculine, almost phallic in a way, this very imposing, macho structure. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for all the ways in which the work is macho or masculine, it's also kind of impossibly ornate. And ornament has always been associated, fairly or unfairly, with femininity and of course, with women, for reasons that are both, again, practical and conceptual. So I think the work is hybrid in that respect as well, which is, I assume, part of what you're getting at. And I think it becomes difficult to maintain a gendered reading of the work, or a reading of the work that finally lands on one term as opposed to the other. You know, a famous essay that many of you will know by Luce, called Ornament and Crime, sets up in the most explicit terms the idea that ornamentation is a negative, that a problem for which modernity will be the solution. And so, you know, certainly in the context of the 20th century, the idea of the austere, the plain, think of your favorite modernist building, the strong, silent type, you know, the modernist skyscraper, that is a preferred scenario to these overly decorative, silly, filigreed buildings, or in Delvoye's case, objects that look like buildings. So I think he's returned us to that kind of, to that underdog, in a sense, or maybe I should put it this way. The underdog to which he returns us is twofold. It's Gothic architecture, which is an underdog in the context of the grand narrative that art history likes to tell, but it's also more generally ornamentation, which is an underdog in the context of 20th century discourse, which aligns it with femininity and therefore with that which is weaker and inessential and all of those nice things we like to say about women. So yeah, I think it's a great point to add to the discussion.
Well, thank you again so much, Isabelle, for taking the time to share the insight. I think all these questions, among others, around contamination and the contradictions and the simultaneous commonalities and so much rich context for reading these works. I really appreciate it. If you haven't already seen the show, please do come and see it, or if perhaps come back and see it again with a whole other lens to look through. Again, March 19th is the end of the exhibition. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you again so much, Isabelle, for your time tonight and the generosity of your answers during the question period are really appreciated. So thanks again. Thank you, everyone.